welcome to Newsmakers for this Thursday, January 30th, 2025. I'm Louie Butko, and thank you for joining us. Well, we are officially in election mode as Premier Doug Ford pulled the trigger on one of the shortest and most expensive elections in the province's history. And here to make sense on why we will head to the polls in late February is our friend Sabrina Nanji. She is the founder and journalist for the Queen's Park Observer. Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us today. I do want to start with this one piece of sound, which I think was the most dramatic from yesterday. So let's play it real quick.
Together we can rise above it all, above it all. Who's gonna fight for you? Who's gonna fight for you? Who's gonna fight for you?
Now, Sabrina, that is what you have when a party has so much money, they can go out and commission an election song. You know, this was an election he needed a mandate for, but I guess that kind of puts it into perspective that, A, this is not a surprise election anyway. This has been planned methodically by Doug Ford and the PCs.
Yeah, I mean, that banger there should have said it all, right? The election call did actually come officially this week. We are in campaign mode, but you're right. It was a bit anticlimactic. It feels like we've been in campaign mode for a long time. It had been heavily rumored that we were headed to the polls more than a year early, and now it's all come to pass. We had day one of the campaign on Wednesday, and all the party leaders were competing for airtime. They all launched their campaigns at the exact same moment, and essentially it was like the race to define the race. We heard from Doug Ford, conservative leader, who thinks this is all about protecting Ontario and dealing with Trump's tariff threat. He says that he's the best position to do that. Meanwhile, NDP leader Marit Stiles and Liberal leader Crombie say this is unnecessary, plunging Ontario into chaos in already chaotic times, and that this is self-serving and really just Doug Ford trying to get out ahead of an RCMP investigation at a time when, he's riding high in the polls. So calling an election would be very advantageous for him. But I think it remains to be seen whether the early election call is going to be the ballot box question, or if it's going to be Trump's tariffs, or, if we're going to see the opposition start to pivot towards healthcare and education. So a lot of wild cards. But, at this early days and in this stage, the polls have been telling us that this is the Conservatives to lose.
You recently sat down with Dan Rath, who was the co-author of Not Without Cause. Randy Rath, his brother, of course, our CHCH Queen's Park producer, because he wrote Not Without Cause, David Peterson's Fall from Grace. And David Peterson was on 1010 last week talking about that having this advantage in the polls, having already a majority government. Is there anything Doug Ford can learn from what David Peterson did, 30 odd years ago this time around?
Yeah, I mean, David Peterson's name has been coming up in Queen's Park circles for months. And, we had heard that a lot of people on Ford's team were reading, very closely Dan Rath's book to try and see if there were lessons learned there. Because we know that in 1990, David Peterson, then Liberal Premier, pulled the trigger on an early election. It was a very similar situation. He was also very popular, like Doug Ford. He had a majority and staring down, the potential recession. And so when he called the election, it was actually seen as opportunistic and self-serving. And then voters ended up punishing him at the polls, which led to Ontario's first and so far only NDP government led by Bob Rae. And so it's very interesting to hear David Peterson this week sort of weigh in on what he thinks. And he said that, there is some vulnerability and risk here for Doug Ford, that if he really can't, sell that message that this is all about, Trump and protecting Ontario, and there could be, billions of stimulus funding coming that he needs a new mandate for, then, maybe he can coast to a victory. But at the same time, the opposition parties, the NDP and the Liberals, will be doing their best to remind people that this is, an even more expensive election than we thought, $189 million. There were only 3 days of advance voting instead of the usual 10. Elections Ontario has a really tight timeline here. And so I think, it's going to be up to Stiles and Crombie to really keep those issues alive and, remind people that Doug Ford has been in power for the last 6 years. And, when it comes to the issues closer to home, like healthcare and education, housing, are we really better off? And so I think we'll start to hear more of that rhetoric as the campaign ramps up.
You mentioned we're seeing Marit, Stiles here now, Bonnie Crombie, everybody on Wednesday basically out the gates at the same time. Bonnie Crombie is in an interesting position because this is her first Ontario election. She still needs to run for her seat. I know you were reporting that she's picked her seat in Mississauga, but what is the biggest challenge facing her right now? We're going to show the poll numbers in just a second, but what would Bonnie Crombie need to do to make this race competitive in 4 weeks' time?
Yeah, Bonnie Crombie is fighting an uphill battle. I mean, she's dealing with months of a multi-million-dollar attack ad spend from the Conservatives. I mean, you just, need to turn on the radio or the TV and those ads have been everywhere. And so she's having to do damage control. The Ontario Liberal Party and the NDP, for that matter, don't even come close when it comes to fundraising compared to the Conservatives. And so obviously they've been making it rain with these attack ads. And but at the same time, we have seen differing polls, some suggesting that the Liberals are gaining steam and actually closing the gap. Some are showing, within 10 points of the Conservatives. But at the same time, Bonnie still has to go out and tour the province. I mean, there was all these questions about where she would be running. She sort of gave that to us at the last minute. And instead of launching her campaign in Mississauga, she'll be running in Mississauga East Cooksville, one of the closest races in that region, which is currently dominated by the Conservatives. But she actually chose to launch her campaign in Barrie. That was one of the closest races for the Liberals in 2022. And she was next to Rose Zacharias, who is their candidate there, former head of the Ontario Medical Association, a star candidate by all means. And she stood there saying, the cost of this election could buy, could get dozens of people doctors in Barrie. And so I think that the challenge for Bonnie is to get that message to stick. And, it's hard to run against Doug Ford when he's been wearing his Captain Canada cape. There's a lot of uncertainty with Donald Trump coming now. But if he's down there in Washington, which he will be during the campaign, it becomes hard for Bonnie Crombie to fight that when Doug Ford is looking like he's going to bat for Canada. So a lot of challenges for her. Not to mention, I'll just say very quickly that she still doesn't have a full slate of candidates yet, including in some very ridings that they would want to pick up, winnable ridings for the Liberals that they would need to get recognized party status, especially in Toronto. You need 12 seats in Ontario to get recognized status. The Liberals don't even have that. That comes with extra money and resources in the House. It makes your job as a party leader a lot easier. But at this point, they've got their work cut out for them.
Especially if she wants to be leader of the opposition, would need sort of official status to be able to do that for sure. You mentioned the polling. I want to throw up the Abacus poll right now because that's one of those ones that's saying they have a commanding lead, that being the Conservatives, 47%. That's up 4% from their poll in December. But if you look at Liaison's poll, they're telling a different story. They're saying 39% for the Conservatives, 33% for the Liberals, 18% for the NDP. So obviously two very drastic polls released this week. Do you think we're somewhere in the middle of those polls, or what do you read of these sort of outliers in themselves this week between the Abacus and Liaison polls?
Yeah, I think the polling, it's been like a polar coaster, if I can put it that way. But no, you're right. Those two polls obviously have been getting a lot of attention. There was a poll from Innovative Research Group that suggested 60% of Ontarians wanted a change in government. And yet, the Conservatives, we see they are still the party to beat, at least across the board. So, yeah, politicians like to say that the only poll that matters is the one on election day. Doug Ford is joking that polls are for dogs. But you're right. It does feel like there are a lot of wild cards here, and campaigns matter, and things could change. There's a wild card in Washington. I mean, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with these tariffs. Doug Ford is already getting his rationale for this election. It's already sort of crumbling. I mean, on his campaign launch, he was pressed by reporters. Well, have you met with Donald Trump yet? What can you actually do? Doug Ford is not necessarily the one at the negotiating table table with Trump, even though he has been, making inroads with governors, as he says. That's more of the Fed's purview. And so I think that, there is a vulnerability for Doug Ford. And now that we're in the campaign, I think people are going to start to pay a lot more attention, and we could see those polls change, especially during the debate, which we're hearing nothing is set in stone yet, could come around Family Day. But I think as the campaign progresses, we could see a shift in those polls. I'm waiting to see, if this really is going to be a cakewalk for Doug Ford.
I did see my first Bonnie Crombie attack ad the other way on Instagram the other day, so obviously that buy is going to start happening. But you mentioned those Bonnie Crombie attack ads from the PCs. Basically, it's been the same ad running for the last year since she's been leader. This is her first elect. This is Marit Stiles' first election. We have to go back all the way to Andrea Horwath the last time, now the mayor of Hamilton. Both obviously facing tough tests, but what would be obviously winning would be a win. But are they going to be looking at sort of ceremonial wins a little bit? Like, they want to beat Doug Ford, but the polls are kind of stacked against him right now.
Yeah, I think, for Marit Stiles and the NDP, the polls say that they're in third place, even though they are, or at least in 2022, they won official opposition. And the challenge for Marit Stiles, for a long time has been that people don't know her. She's relatively unknown. But at the same time, the people that do know her, they like her and they like what they see. So that is really the big thing for the NDP this time around is putting Marit out there and raising her profile. But she has been leader for 2 years. So again, they've also got their work cut out for them. We have seen them start to roll out more ads on TV. They said that they would be saving that for the actual campaign period. So we'll start to see more on TV, more on radio. Those ads don't come cheap. And like I said, the Conservatives have just blown their rivals out of the water when it comes to raising money, even though the NDP, they claim they have about 10 million in the bank, which is no small feat for that party, which, typically is the party of smaller grassroots donors. But yeah, you're right. I think I'm going to be looking at the regional races. The NDP lost a lot of key seats in the 905, Brampton and Mississauga, in the Windsor area in the north. And those are places that the PCs are gunning for the most, including the Liberals too. I mean, the Liberals need to pick up some of those seats in Toronto from the NDP, and as well as the 905. Another riding I'll be watching close to your neck in the woods, of course, is Hamilton Centre. Sarah Jama, who's running as an independent, and the NDP said they do not want her running for them again. But again, I think that will be a race that's close to watch. I know the Conservatives in particular have been making a really hard push for the Hamilton area, so I think that I'm watching to see how that one plays out too.
Well, of course, Neil Lumsden, now cabinet minister, winning that Stoney Creek seat, which was NDP for 22 years before he won it. Back to Bonnie Crombie again. She's sort of in the same boat as Marit Stiles. I was talking to some of my friends this past weekend, basically letting them know that there's going to be an election. They're not tuned in. And that brings me to my next point, because a lot of people, when I said Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles, they asked, who is that? And last election, 44% turnout. That was the lowest by 4%. That election was in June. That election was, I believe, a set date. Now we're running the shortest election in the winter. Is it just a certainty at this point that turnout record will be broken again? And how do parties fight that? How do parties get people out to the polls?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that all parties are struggling with right now. I mean, nobody, myself included, I'll say, wants to be out on the campaign trail in frigid temperatures. And you're right, we do know that there's a reason why we have fixed election dates, and that they are in, the spring or the fall, because the weather is better, and it's, just easier to go out and run an election. We actually got some sobering news from the Chief Electoral Officer, Greg Asenza, yesterday, who said that, because of this tight timeline and the snap vote, there's only going to be 3 days of advanced polling instead of the usual 10. And the thinking there is that, advanced polls, people might use those more just because they might not want to go out on February 27th. The Chief Electoral Officer said there's already contingency plans in the works in case there's a blizzard on voting day and people can't get out. But I've been hearing from politicians and wannabe politicians that they're worried about being able to get their lawn signs in the ground because the ground is frozen, or, knocking on someone's door and they don't want to talk, or or keep their door open and let the heat out. So there's a lot here, and we know that lower turnout tends to favor incumbents. In some cases, tends to favor conservatives, and I think that that's certainly not lost on the Tories team. But getting out the vote is going to matter for everybody here, and we know that in some cases, even in last year's by-elections, the Tories have hired door-knocking companies, so they're paying their people to go out. And I'm not sure, if the other parties really have that same financial might behind that. They say that they've got, their volunteers are coming out, but at the same time, it is very cold, and I don't think anyone wants to be there.
You mentioned the financial might. It's also we're talking about the power of incumbency, because Monday and Tuesday, it seemed like every 15 minutes my phone was dinging about release from the government of Ontario of funding announcement. Just take us through your chaotic week. You're writing a newsletter that keeps track of everything going on at Queen's Park. It's only Thursday, Sabrina, just reminding you of that. What has this week been like for you as a journalist?
Yeah, it's been a blur. Obviously, there's so much going on. There was a flurry of announcements and actually even re-announcements here, right, from the Conservatives. They were trying to get those out the door, all those good news nuggets for voters to sink their teeth into. But you're right. It's just been nonstop. All the leaders launched their campaign at the same hour. They're all competing for prime time. But we just, I guess, at least in the newsletter, you just try and make a big rundown of everything. I think it's important for people to understand what is actually at stake here, because there is this big question of what is the ballot box issue. And I'm looking forward to getting some more policies from these parties. Doug Ford is talking about how he needs a mandate to, approve his tariff fighting plan, but we haven't seen that yet. His cabinet got a peek at it, and he says they'll be rolling it out over the next 28 days. We need to see costed plans from the NDP and the Liberals. The NDP have been making some pretty bold promises, scrapping tolls outright on the 407, but there's no costing behind it. And so I think it's been a lot of these big splashy announcements, but not a lot of meat behind it. And so that's kind of what I'm looking forward to digging into most.
There was also an FAO report that dropped on Monday about the expansion of beer and alcohol sales, the $1.4 billion. So, credit to the Liberals. They were calling this $1 billion boondoggle. How many times do you think we're going to hear that? And to that point, why haven't we heard about those houses, the housing numbers that they wanted to build? Wasn't it 1.5 million homes by 20? Like that. It seems like housing has just not become an issue for Conservatives right now.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Doug Ford in his campaign launch didn't mention healthcare or housing. He talked a lot about what's going on in the States. And so clearly that's what, he wants to keep people thinking about that. And we're going to be hearing from the NDP and the Liberals that, about his record on healthcare and housing. And you're right, housing starts are in the dumps right now. And we're way off the goal that we would need to be to get to what what Ford has proposed. But you're right. I think that having the opposite, it's hard for the opposition to get their message out there and to get it to stick. And so I think that's really going to be the challenge for them. But yeah, I think maybe during the debate, once we start to see the meat of these policies, then we might start to see a shift in the polls and people, paying closer attention to what's really at stake.
Yeah, and I think that's the other part of it, is paying closer attention. And you and I have a responsibility to make sure people are informed on what's going on. But also, voters need to hold themselves responsible to know the issues and know what each party stands for and which each party has done. Sabrina, I know you were very busy this week, so I appreciate you making a small window of time today to get us set for this election. 4 weeks today. I cannot even believe it, saying that out loud. But good luck.
Thanks.
Awesome. Sabrina Nanji. She's the founder and lead journalist at the Queen's Park Observer. I always tell you to subscribe to the Queen's Park Observer. If you ever are going to pick a time to do it, now is the time to do it. Queen's Park Observer. It is a key document for you to start your day, especially in these elections time. My thanks to Sabrina for joining me today. My thanks to you as well. Thanks to Laura Brody for directing today's episode. And hey, while you're here, make sure you like and subscribe to CHCH Podcast. You never miss an episode of this show or any of the other great shows we have for you, including Sportsline with Bubba O'Neill. Go check that out wherever you found this show, or go to chch.com/podcast. All right, one more time, thank you for checking us out. And from all of us here at CHCH, I'm Louie Butko, hoping you have a great day.